I'm Dr. Katharina Lefringhausen from the University of Warwick, and I will talk about my research on a new route towards more harmonious intergroup relationships in England, majority members Proximal-Acculturation. And this is part of the session entitled Acculturation, Adaptation, and Culture Shock. So at Warwick, I teach a module with students where I ask them to think about intercultural trainings for different groups and contexts. And one of these is for volunteers, British volunteers who work with refugees in the UK. What I often then hear students say is, well, those volunteers are white, they're British, so maybe we can foster their tolerance or reduce the unconscious bias towards refugees, so that will help refugees to integrate. And I often react with the question, well, really? That's it? I mean, we expect refugees to integrate, but you don't expect the same to happen for white British nationals towards refugees' cultures. Why? Now, you all are familiar with the theory of acculturation, which states that when members of different cultures come into contact, they may experience changes in their behaviors, cultural values, and identity. Now, sometimes implicitly, but also explicitly in the literature was stated, we expect this to happen for minority members because they're not the dominant group in a society. They have less power, less representation. So there might be a lot more pressure for them to adapt to this new cultural way of life. And as you know, Barry's bidimensional acculturation model allows immigrants, for example, or other minority members to integrate. So for instance, me as a German immigrant in the UK, I have the chance to maintain elements of my German heritage culture, as well as adapt to the UK host culture. But it's not just integration that a bidimensional acculturation model allows. You could also separate, so would just remain German, or assimilate, I fully become British, or may even experience marginalization. So I feel I don't fit into any cultural context. Now, majority members acculturation was conceptualized quite differently because of this assumed dominant or more power position. So when we think about white English nationals, we don't see them being pressured into changing. So they are being seen as gatekeepers of the acculturation process of minority members. So when we look at acculturation expectations or perceptions with regard to minority members or with regard to intergroup ideology, so what majority members hope for or prefer how society and policies would manage cultural diversity in their country. More recently, however, we have discovered that globalization-based acculturation does happen. So you don't need to leave your country in order to experience cultural changes. You can also have this because of interacting with different cultural products, interacting with tourism. More specifically, remote acculturation focuses and has reported continuously that members such as Jamaican youth can adapt to the US culture that is remote, so geographically distant through media consumption or food, or the distant contact with relatives or friends who live in the States. Now we switch this further around and propose, well, what about majority members and their relationship to minority members in a shared society? So not distant cultures, but those that are right there in the same environment. So what we would term globalization-based proximal acculturation. In other words, majority member psychological acculturation towards ethnic minority cultures in a shared society. And so far, my past research, including my PhD thesis, I found that there are two underlying dimensions, two similar what Barry proposed. So we have immigrant cultural adoption as one dimension independent from majority members' national cultural maintenance. Immigrant cultural adoption has been found to be positively related to things like intercultural sensitivity, also understood as ethno-relativism, and more welcoming acculturation expectations. It also reduces acculturative stress and unwelcoming acculturation expectations. National cultural maintenance, meanwhile, relates to more subjective well-being and more national group commitment. Using a person-centered approach, Hogang and Kunst, and later on Kunst, myself, and some other colleagues, we actually applied a person-centered approach to majority members' proximal acculturation, finding different strategy groups like separated and integrated, even marginalized or diffused individuals. So as you can see here, the undifferentiated cluster meaning those are not so low in their cultural orientation that they would be categorized as marginalized, but they're somehow in the middle of the scale. So clearly taking this together, knowing that it seems that majority members are experiencing acculturation as well, change is happening here too. We thought with this pre-registered research that looking at these two underlying dimensions, let's use a person-centered approach to find what acculturation strategy groups emerge from the data. So a quite bottom-up approach. And as you've seen before, integration, separation, and undifferentiation seem to be very likely to appear, but who knows, maybe something else might pop up as well. What about assimilation, or again, a marginalized group, or maybe something completely different? So this is in our first hypothesis, partially exploratory, partially expecting those prior strategies. Now, by considering several control variables like social desirability, we then were interested in how do these different strategies for majority members vary across certain outcome variables. For example, we expected that those who are undifferentiated, so again, who are more in the middle with the cultural orientations, would experience constructive marginalization more. So this is when people feel they're not really embedded in any cultural context. They feel comfortable moving around different cultures, but they don't feel part of a certain framework. Our second hypothesis related to the idea that those who are integrated or separated will much stronger identify with their national group. And this would take and push the previous work a bit further because Hogan and Kunz showed that majority members are more likely to report changes with regard to behavior, so food or cultural festivals that they might attend, but no one really reports identity change. So tapping into variations in national identification might give us an idea whether identity change might help happen as well. Then we also looked into whether those strategies might vary across feelings of cultural enrichment or threat by the presence of immigrants in the country. And of course, we would expect that those who are separated would experience more threat. So when we think about the multiculturalism hypothesis or the integrated threat theory, that would suggest something like this. So you're not used to other cultures, more likely to be threatened by them, versus those who embrace novelty. So those who are integrated or even undifferentiated might experience more enrichment. Now, last, we were thinking that those who are integrated and undifferentiated are probably also those who experience more contact. So they have more chance to potentially take on board some cultural orientations or have the chance to make the decision for themselves not to want to be culturally embedded. So that they would probably have more this form of contact than, for instance, separated majority members. Now, our data was from the UK, particularly knowing that there's still ongoing immigration influx because despite Brexit, and yet Brexit also poses this interesting question of where we have those leave majority members, we have remain majority members, so we have a political divided country. So as I said, we had English majority members who were white, had to be born in the UK, and were born in England and currently living in England, but had a UK citizenship. So our pilot study had 63 participants and our main study had 220. Notably, the majority of our participants also had no migratory background. Here are our scales, which I won't go into detail because you can look them up on the pre-registration on OSF, but just wanted to highlight that we had multiple indicators for intergroup contact. As you can see, an objective indicator with how diverse was the area of residency to the perception of intercultural contact, either face-to-face or mediated. So for our pilot study, we didn't include or could test all the hypotheses, but starting with trying to find those strategies, we did two-step cluster analysis, and we found 3 groups: an integrated group, an undifferentiated group, and a separated group. And as you can see here, they clearly varied in those 2 underlying dimensions of national cultural maintenance and immigrant cultural adoption. So here are the significant differences for immigrant cultural adoption. Now, doing a more sophisticated test for our main study, we use Latin profile analysis, multiple indicators in order to specify which profile solution fits the data best. again finding 3 strategy groups. So here, again, we have an integrated and separated group. As you can see, again, the underlying cultural orientations are significantly different amongst these cluster groups. And we also found an assimilated group, quite intriguing. So putting this together, using a person-centered approach, so looking at the data, deriving strategies from the data, we found 4 strategies overall, which was separation, integration, undifferentiation, and assimilation. Just with assimilation, it kind of poses the question, are there some functional benefits to assimilate, or are there pressures experienced by English majority members to follow the strategy? So that might be interesting to look into in further research. Now, in the pilot study, we also tested whether those strategy groups would vary across the experience of threat and enrichment. And as you can see, as we expected, the separated group experienced most threat, whereas integrated and undifferentiated experienced most enrichment. For the main study, we tested all our hypotheses. Now, as you saw, the problem, however, with this was we didn't find an undifferentiated group in our main study. So we needed to change our hypothesis slightly to make sense of our findings. So here I talk about each individually. Our second hypothesis was about constructive marginalization. Now, what we found is that those who are assimilated and integrated endorsed more of this feeling of being not really culturally embedded, at least more than separated. And this makes sense because in our previous work, we found that the underlying cultural orientation of immigrant cultural adoption positively related to intercultural sensitivity, which is an indicator of ethno-relativism. And ethno-relativism underlies the construct of constructive marginalization. Now, with identification with English citizens, we found exactly what we expected. That is, the separated group was the strongest with regard to English identification, followed by the integrated sample, and with the assimilated least. So that means that actually change can happen beyond the behavioral domain for majority members. They actually might experience identity change because of their acculturation to immigrants' cultures. With cultural threat and enrichment, as I mentioned before, we found support for our hypotheses. And intergroup contact, funnily enough, no significant results. Now, this could have multiple reasons. One of this may be, rather than contact, for majority members may be ideologies or norms perceived stronger predictors or stronger related to what strategy group they are following. But we still haven't answered whether following different strategies or having these 2 cultural orientations can actually lead to more harmonious intergroup relationships. So we also did a parallel mediation analysis. And as you can see here, we have cultural threat only partially is mediated by national cultural maintenance towards positive feelings towards immigrants. For intergroup contact, both national cultural maintenance and immigrant cultural adoption function as mediators, but not really strongly. And it was mainly the immigrant cultural adoption variable. Whereas for cultural enrichment, both function as strong mediators for this relationship. So overall, we can say that both orientations seem to be crucial in explaining relationships of perceiving other cultures as threat or enrichment or having contact with other cultures in relating to positive attitudes towards minority members. But very interestingly, with the cultural threat component, that there was only a partial mediation, poses the question, what sort of moderation might happening here? Maybe some English nationals understand their culture as a civic idea versus others as an ethnic idea, so more exclusionary. Overall, we can say findings address a blind spot in the acculturation research. That is, it is time to not just address how majority members perceive and address minority members, but also how do they change themselves to the other cultures they experience in a shared society. And remembering that class exercise I told you about in the beginning, well, actually, this is not just an exercise, but a real life project where I work with Theatre UK, giving training to volunteers who work with refugees. And we use this concept of majority members acculturation as strategies, trying to give them help in interpretation of what they do in relation to refugees. And as you can see, it has been a very fruitful enterprise, especially for the volunteers, to make sense of how they work with refugees. Here are all my references, and here is the link to the paper. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.